When both you and the person who has been draining your energy go quiet, it does not mean the world has suddenly become a place of peace. In reality, it often feels as though something volatile is detonating just beneath the surface. At that exact moment, someone finally starts to lose their grip on the situation, and it is crucial for you to realize that it is not you. Most people tend to assume that when two people fall into a state of mutual silence, the story has reached its natural conclusion. They believe it signifies that both parties have finally accepted the outcome and chosen to move forward with their lives. However, the truth of the matter is frequently much more unsettling than that. This is precisely the stage where the other person begins to experience a true psychological downward spiral. Simultaneously, this is often the exact point where your own journey toward healing finally begins to take root. You need to stay with this concept, because what happens in the following moments is the part that almost no one ever prepares you for. If everything you are hearing right now feels uncomfortably familiar, you need to keep listening. It is essential that you understand the psychological landscape you are currently navigating. Having a clear grasp of this terrain is often what gives people the strength they need to break the cycle for good. Let us go deeper into this dynamic. When both you and this person cease all contact with one another, the very first occurrence on their side is something that can be described as a recalibration phase. It is a very subtle process. It is entirely psychological in nature. Most people fail to notice it because it takes place in total silence, behind the scenes, long before the person ever decides to make a move. When you choose to step back and become quiet, you often experience this as a significant emotional shift. You see it as the act of setting a firm boundary. You view it as stepping back from a toxic situation. You might even view it as the very beginning of your personal healing process. The person you are dealing with almost always interprets your silence in a very different way. To them, your silence is not just an absence of communication. It becomes valuable information. It transforms into data that they feel they must analyze and interpret. Your decision not to respond becomes a puzzle they feel compelled to decode rather than a boundary they choose to respect. They begin to ask themselves how they managed to lose their grip on you, rather than questioning how they might have hurt you in the first place. These types of individuals generally do not engage in the kind of deep self-reflection that emotionally healthy people participate in. Instead of wondering whether their actions caused you pain, they often begin to evaluate the situation from a tactical standpoint. They wonder if you have become distracted by something else. They ask themselves if you are intentionally trying to punish them by staying quiet. They wonder if someone new has entered your life. They ask themselves if you are simply testing their patience. They are constantly searching for hidden motives. They search for underlying meanings in your actions. They search for any potential threats to their status. Your silence essentially becomes a riddle they feel forced to solve because, to them, uncertainty is incredibly destabilizing. During this entire recalibration phase, they might not make any attempt to contact you at all. Do not make the mistake of thinking their silence is the same thing as indifference. Very often, it is a calculated strategy. They may quietly observe your activity on social media. They may pay close attention to the things they hear from mutual friends. They may keep a silent watch to see who interacts with you and how frequently those interactions occur. They are busy gathering intelligence. They are waiting to see what your next emotional move is going to be. Many people with these traits operate under the firm belief that those they once controlled will eventually return to the fold. Because of this deeply held belief, they rarely interpret your silence as a sign that you have finally achieved closure. Instead, they view it as a temporary form of resistance. This is exactly why they do not always experience a sense of panic right away. They hold back because they want to see if you will break first. They assume that, just as you may have done in the past, you will eventually reach out to them. They rely heavily on the behavioral patterns they helped foster within you. They count on your sense of guilt, your fear of ongoing conflict, and the flicker of hope you still hold that peace can somehow be restored. They genuinely expect you to give in to that pressure. When you find the strength to remain silent, their internal recalibration grows significantly more intense. They start to wonder if their influence over you is finally slipping away for good. That is the exact moment when the entire situation begins to feel threatening to them. In their view of the world, silence is never a neutral thing. To them, it is either an opportunity to regain their lost dominance or a genuine danger to their ego. The longer you manage to remain silent, the more unstable the ground beneath their feet begins to feel. Your choice to stay quiet effectively interrupts the power dynamic they had come to depend upon for their own stability. When both sides fall into this state of silence, the emotional experience is vastly different for you than it is for them. This stark difference reveals an uncomfortable but necessary truth. You are often the one feeling the weight of the loss. They, on the other hand, are often just feeling the inconvenience of the situation. When you finally stop contacting them, you are typically the one carrying the heavy emotional burden of everything that transpired between you. You are the one sorting through the wreckage of broken trust. You are the one trying to make sense of the questions that were never answered. You are actively processing the exhaustion that comes from being emotionally drained. You may feel deep waves of sadness. You may experience moments of profound confusion. You may struggle with a lingering sense of guilt that was placed upon you. You may even find yourself grieving the version of yourself that accepted far more mistreatment than you ever should have. Your silence is almost always born out of extreme emotional overload. You have reached a breaking point where your mind and your body can no longer tolerate the ongoing chaos. You are fighting to reclaim your personal space. You are trying to reclaim your sense of dignity. You are working hard to reclaim your clarity of thought. That internal struggle you are dealing with is incredibly heavy. It takes a toll on your ability to sleep. It affects your confidence in your own judgment. It clouds your memories. It ultimately impacts your entire sense of identity. Meanwhile, the person you have stepped away from is usually interpreting your silence through a completely different lens. They do not generally sit with the feeling of loss in the same way that you do. They do not spend very much time reflecting on where things went wrong. They do not naturally examine the ways in which they caused you harm. They do not immediately ask themselves what they need to change about their own behavior to be a better person. Instead, their very first reaction is almost always rooted in the feeling of inconvenience. Your silence disrupts their established routine rather than breaking their heart. They had become accustomed to having constant access to you. They were used to having constant access to your attention. They expected access to your emotional reactions whenever they wanted them. They took for granted the access to your apologies when they were the ones who were wrong. They had access to your caretaking and your willingness to fix things. They even felt entitled to access to your arguments and your defensive responses. Every single emotional response you gave them served to reinforce their deep-seated sense of importance. When you finally go silent, that steady, reliable stream of validation suddenly comes to a complete halt. This does not necessarily devastate them on a deeply emotional level as it might with someone who truly loved you. Instead, it frustrates them. They experience the absence of your response much like someone who has lost access to a luxury service they had come to depend upon. It feels deeply disruptive to their day-to-day life. It feels like an irritating obstacle in their path rather than a loss of a human connection. It feels like a massive inconvenience to them. Their focus is not on the fact that they have lost a person who truly mattered to them. Instead, their mental energy is entirely directed toward figuring out why you have stopped responding to them. Your pain and their feelings of inconvenience exist in two completely different psychological universes. You are in the middle of mourning the death of a relationship. They are simply evaluating how to regain access to your attention. You are putting in the hard work to rebuild your own life. They are just trying to understand how your decision to be silent is negatively affecting their ego. You are the one experiencing a sense of emptiness. They are simply feeling the interruption of their routine. As more time passes, this sharp contrast becomes even more obvious. You begin to realize just how much emotional weight you were carrying for the sake of the partnership. You begin to recognize how often you chose to stay silent just to keep the peace. Meanwhile, they begin to question why the strategies that used to work so effortlessly are no longer effective. The emotional responsiveness you used to offer has suddenly vanished. The imbalance between you two becomes impossible to ignore. Your silence is pushing you down a path of introspection and genuine healing. Their silence is pushing them toward feelings of deep annoyance and a sense of entitlement. The emotional burden you are carrying is profound. The discomfort they are dealing with is almost entirely connected to losing the convenience of your compliance rather than losing a human connection. When both sides remain silent, the person you are dealing with does not experience that quiet as a restful pause. They do not view it as a shared space where both people can take a step back. They do not interpret it as two people moving on. Instead, they almost always experience it as a direct and aggressive challenge to their ego. When you remain silent after they have spent so much time controlling you, it feels like an act of rebellion. These individuals tend to view relationships through the lens of power and dominance rather than mutual respect and give and take. So, when you stop responding, stop reaching out, and stop feeding them your attention, it creates a massive disturbance in the psychological hierarchy they believed existed. They interpret your choice to be silent as an act of defiance, even when your true intention is simply to protect your inner peace or regain some clarity. In their mind, silence is never a neutral thing. It instantly becomes a form of resistance. It becomes a form of disrespect. It becomes concrete evidence that their influence over you is finally fading away. This is exactly why silence often impacts them much more deeply than even your loudest arguments ever did. Arguments actually provided them with a sense of relevance. Your emotional reactions gave them a feeling of power. Even your anger served to reassure them that they still occupied a significant amount of space in your emotional world. Silence, however, removes them from the center of the stage. That removal is a direct threat to the fragile narrative they depend on to survive. For perhaps the first time, your silence forces them to confront the painful possibility that they are not as indispensable, as desirable, or as dominant as they always convinced themselves they were. These individuals do not operate from a stable, healthy sense of self-worth. Their self-esteem is almost entirely built from the outside in. It is held together by the attention, the reactions, the admiration, and the validation they manage to extract from the people in their lives. You were once a crucial part of that system. Your emotions mattered to them immensely. Your responses were the fuel they needed to keep going. Your cycle of returning to them after every conflict was vital to their stability. Every apology you offered, every desperate attempt to explain yourself, and every effort you made to repair the broken pieces reinforced their sense of influence and superiority. When you finally go silent, that entire cycle is interrupted. That interruption forces them into a moment of pure psychological exposure. It confronts them with a truth they do not want to acknowledge, even to themselves. It exposes just how dependent they actually became on your engagement. They spent a long time building a story in which they were the dominant one, the one in control, and the one deciding exactly how close you were allowed to get and how far you were allowed to go. Your decision to stay silent challenges that story in a way they cannot ignore. It suggests that you have finally stepped outside of the specific role they assigned to you. That realization causes the carefully managed identity they worked so hard to maintain to become unstable. Without your reactions, they have nothing to push against, nothing to manipulate, and nothing to use as proof of their own power. This absence of your presence becomes threatening to them. It is not threatening because they are grieving the relationship in a deep and emotionally mature way, but because it destroys the foundation of control that allowed them to feel significant. This is usually the point where their internal state becomes restless and chaotic. They may begin replaying old conversations over and over again in their minds. They search for signs they think they might have missed. They start to wonder if someone else has successfully taken their place. They begin scanning their environment for any opportunity to regain their dominance, even if they have not actually reached out to you yet. The silence becomes much louder for them than it ever was for you. They do not know what is happening in your world anymore. They cannot see your thoughts. They cannot predict your next choices. That lack of visibility strips away the illusion that they understand and control your every move. Suddenly, they are no longer standing at the center of your universe. And that sudden loss of importance feels psychologically intolerable to them. Their way of thinking shifts drastically. Arrogance gives way to anxiety. Entitlement gives way to suspicion. A false sense of certainty gives way to deep instability. All of these feelings can be triggered by something as simple as your absence. When both you and this person retreat into silence, it may appear to an outside observer that nothing is happening. But internally, they often begin moving through a predictable series of behaviors designed to compensate for their loss and restore their sense of control. One of the most common reactions is the attempt to fill the void your absence created through tactics like hoovering, baiting, or triangulation. These behaviors are not random occurrences. They are calculated psychological tools they use the moment they feel their influence over you slipping away. Hoovering often begins when they realize that your silence is not just a temporary phase. At the beginning, they assume you will eventually return. They believe this firmly because it has happened so many times before. They have come to expect your return as a guarantee. When you do not come back, a sense of panic can begin to bubble up to the surface. Hoovering then becomes a desperate attempt to pull you back into the cycle. This is not because they have suddenly realized your value in a healthier way, but because losing access to you threatens the stability of their ego. They may decide to send a gentle, seemingly innocent message. They might bring up a shared, nostalgic memory that was once happy. They might suddenly describe a personal crisis that requires your immediate attention and care. They might appear to be full of remorse. They might act like they have been doing some deep, thoughtful reflecting. They may even become uncharacteristically attentive to your needs. They will adjust their approach to whatever they believe is most likely to break through your defenses. The goal is never a genuine, healthy reconnection. The goal is always the restoration of their own control. If their attempt at hoovering fails, or if it feels too vulnerable for them to continue, they may shift their tactics into baiting. Baiting is specifically designed to provoke a strong emotional response from you. It does not matter to them whether that reaction is positive or negative. What matters is that they were the cause of it. They might post something on social media that is clearly intended to trigger your jealousy. They might send a cold, dismissive, or cruel message designed to make you angry enough to reply. They might even create unnecessary drama that forces your focus back onto them. Any reaction you give them serves to restore their sense of relevance. Silence is the only thing that successfully strips away their power. Baiting becomes an attempt to reopen the emotional wounds they helped create. They hope that you react strongly enough to prove that you are still emotionally available and hooked into their drama. When these strategies also fail, they may escalate the situation into triangulation. This involves bringing a third person into the mix. It could be an ex-partner, a new romantic interest, a friend, or even a family member. The purpose here is not to form a genuine connection with that other person. The purpose is to maintain control over you. They may show off a new relationship to make it look like they have moved on perfectly. They may suggest that someone else appreciates them and loves them much more than you ever did.